In a cave in northern Alabama, there is a ceiling low enough to touch while sitting down. Drawn across it, in clay that was once soft, is a snake more than 11 feet long. Nobody saw it. Not the cavers who crawled beneath it for years, not the archaeologists who mapped the chamber and went home. And almost certainly not the person who drew it there. The rock sits too close to the floor, there is no way to back up. For roughly 18 centuries, the largest cave drawing on this continent had no witness who could take it in. Which raises the question this entire investigation runs on. Why make something enormous in a place where it can never be seen? And who was it for? 3 things about this cave refuse to sit quietly, and each of them cuts against the story that usually gets told about it. The first is the snake itself, longer than a pickup truck, marked with the pattern of a real species that still hunts those same woods. The second is the name. This cave carries a number where a name should be, and that blank was deliberate. The third is a correction. Because almost every retelling of this place gets a single word wrong, and that one word hides the strangest thing about the site. The cave lies on private land in the northern part of the state, in limestone country cut through by creeks, springs, and collapsed sinkholes. Above ground, the place is completely ordinary. Pine and hardwood, red clay, the kind of ridge a hunter walks across without a second thought. Below ground, the rock opens differently than anybody expects it to. The passages there run flat and wide instead of deep and dramatic. One of those low passages widens out into a single chamber measuring more than 5,000 square feet of continuous floor. A room underground, in other words, holding more floor space than most of the houses standing on the ridge above it. And almost none of that enormous room is tall enough for a grown adult to stand upright anywhere inside it. Less than 3 feet, floor to rock. In places, the gap narrows until it is barely 2 feet, and moving forward means lying flat and pushing along with the elbows. This is what archaeologists call the dark zone, the part of a cave that daylight has never reached at any hour of any season. People went in anyway. They went in carrying fire, they went in far past the last daylight, and they went in to work. The surface waiting for them was a thin skin of wet clay, laid down across the rock by floodwater over an enormous span of time. And the question only sharpens as the passage narrows down. What exactly is worth crawling this far into the dark to draw? Clay of that kind takes a fingertip the way skin takes a scar. It records the gesture exactly, and it does not forgive. Press once and the line stays there for centuries. Press in the wrong place, and that mistake stays too, permanently. One attempt, no revisions. Picture the position the work demanded. A person flat on their back in total darkness, holding a burning reed torch in one hand. The other hand reaching up into a ceiling perhaps a foot above their face, drawing a curve they could not step back to judge. The light source is also the clock. A reed torch burns steadily down while the work is happening, and it does not wait. Whatever was made in that chamber was made against a burning clock by a body held in one cramped and unnatural shape. And it was made well, which is the detail that turns a curiosity into a serious archaeological problem worth solving. 5 images, that is the count. 3 of the 5 are human in shape, and the remaining 2 are snakes drawn at a length that has no parallel on this continent. The smaller serpent runs beyond 7 feet across the stone. The larger one passes 11, coiled and anatomically specific in its markings. Which is the point where scale stops being a statistic in a report and becomes the central problem of the site. 11 feet is longer than the room is tall in any direction a human eye positioned inside it can possibly look. The human figures stand more than 6 feet in height, and one of them wears what the researchers carefully describe as regalia. Ceremonial dress, in other words, not a stick figure, but a person shown deliberately, in specific clothing, at the scale of a living body. Around those 5 large images sit much smaller ones, insects and birds, scattered across the same ceiling like notes written into a margin. The small figures can be taken in with a single glance. The large ones cannot be taken in from any position in that room. That gap is the whole case. To understand why that ceiling behaves the way it does, the rock underneath this whole story has to be read first. Limestone dissolves in slightly acidic water. A crack becomes a seam, the seam widens, and eventually the seam becomes a passage. Where the water spread sideways through the layers instead of cutting downward, it left rooms that are broad and flat rather than tall. The clay arrived later, carried in by floodwater and pressed up against that ceiling as the water rose and drained away again. So the surface that made the artwork possible is precisely the same surface that made the finished artwork impossible to see. The cave handed these people a canvas, and in the very same gesture took away the distance needed to look at it. Nothing about that arrangement is mystical or deliberate. It is drainage, behaving exactly the way that drainage behaves everywhere else. The mystery in this cave is human, not geological. Which brings the investigation to the next question, and it is the one that usually gets answered badly in retellings when cave clay carries no date of its own. The drawing itself cannot be measured directly, because clay was never a living thing. What can be measured is everything the visitors dropped, burned, or abandoned on the floor while they were down there working. Fragments of pottery scattered across the chamber floor. Charred remains of the reed torches that lit the ceiling while it was drawn. Both of those things once lived, and both hold a signature that decays on a schedule physics understands with real precision. Carbon keeps time. The pottery answers separately, because ceramic styles change over generations and a broken rim can be placed within a few centuries. 2 independent clocks, built on completely different principles, pointing at the same stretch of centuries and agreeing with each other. The drawings belong to the woodland period, somewhere inside the long window running between the 2nd century and the 10th. One charcoal sample from a burned reed torch lands early in that window. Another line of evidence sits considerably later inside it, which is honest and worth stating plainly rather than smoothing over. The exact year is not known, and the range itself is the answer. What the range does establish beyond argument is who was living in that country during the centuries when this work was done. These were settled farming communities of the American Southeast, growing crops on the ridges, firing pottery, burying their dead with evident care. People with a settled and ordinary world above ground, who chose to crawl into the dark and work on a ceiling nobody would ever admire. That choice is the artifact. The chamber itself was never a dwelling of any kind. Nobody lived out a life under a ceiling 2 feet from the floor. There are no cooking hearths, no sleeping floors, and none of the ordinary debris that collects wherever people spend ordinary time. Whatever that room was for, it had exactly one purpose, and the answer to what that purpose was is still ahead. For most of the 20th century, none of this was known, because cave art in North America was not considered a real category of evidence. The first examples were documented only in the late 1970s, and an entire field grew out of almost nothing after that. Dozens of sites followed across the Southeast, and most of them were found by cavers rather than by professors with grants. People who crawl for fun found the record. This particular cave entered the literature in the late 1990s, when a caver and an archaeologist worked through the passages together. They saw drawings. They described drawings carefully and in print. They did not see what was actually spread across that ceiling. And the reason deserves real precision, because told carelessly it sounds like negligence, which is not what happened here. It was not carelessness on anybody's part. It was geometry, and geometry does not negotiate with expertise or with patience. A headlamp throws a circle of light, perhaps 2 feet across, onto a surface sitting a foot from the observer's face. Inside that circle of light, a line is only a line. It could belong to anything at all, or to nothing. Move the light and a fresh circle appears, while the previous one drops straight back into complete darkness behind the observer. The eye never holds the whole. A person could trace the entire 11-foot serpent with a fingertip and crawl out still not knowing they had touched a serpent, which is remarkably close to the position of the person who first drew it there, roughly 18 centuries before the headlamp. 2 people separated by all of that time, in the same low room, working blind under exactly the same handicap. The difference is that the modern one eventually found a way around the problem, and that way did not involve eyes. In the second decade of this century, a team came back into the chamber carrying cameras instead of sketchbooks and measuring tape. The plan was not to photograph the drawings. The plan was to photograph the entire ceiling, whether it held drawings or not. All of it in thousands of overlapping frames. From every angle, the cramped passage would physically allow a camera to sit. The technique is called photogrammetry, and the idea underneath it is almost disappointingly ordinary. Any 2 photographs of the same object, taken from slightly different positions, contain between them the 3-dimensional shape of that object. Software finds the points appearing in both frames, works backward to where each camera stood, and rebuilds the surface from that geometry. Do it with thousands of frames, and the result is not a picture at all. It is a measurable model of the rock itself. A copy of the ceiling, accurate to the millimeter, that can be carried out of the cave and examined anywhere. 2 months of fieldwork went into the recording in a chamber where standing upright was never once an option for anybody. 16,000 photographs came out of those 2 months of work underground in the dark. Around 4,000 built the final model. Then the ceiling was lifted off the rock, put onto a screen, and a person could finally do the one impossible thing: step back. What appeared on that screen was not remotely what anyone had been describing in print for the previous 20 years. The scattered, apparently meaningless lines resolved themselves into whole figures, and those figures turned out to be enormous. A diamond-patterned serpent running 11 feet across the stone, coiled with evident intention and anatomically specific in its markings. Human shapes at life size and beyond, one of them dressed for some occasion that nobody alive today can name. Hidden in plain sight, on a surface anyone could touch. It is worth being exact at this point, because this is precisely where the story goes wrong in almost every retelling of it. Nothing here was concealed by anyone. No chamber was sealed, no passage was blocked, and nobody hid anything from anybody at any point. The images were invisible for a physical reason, and that reason is a ceiling sitting a foot above the observer face. A human eye needs distance to assemble a large shape out of parts, and this rock refuses to give any distance. Lie flat on the floor of that chamber. Look straight up, and the serpent still will not fit inside one field of view. The camera did not see better than the eye. It simply saw from more places, and the computer added those places together. That is the entire trick, and there is nothing else to it. Patience, overlap, and arithmetic, applied for 2 months underground. No magic, just enough angles. Which leaves the original question standing exactly where it stood at the very beginning, only considerably sharper now. The makers had the same eye and the same ceiling. What they lacked was a model waiting for them on a screen. So how does a person draw an 11-foot animal that they are physically unable to look at while drawing it? The research team answered that in a single sentence, and it is the most striking line in the entire publication. The images are so large that the makers had to create them without being able to see them in their entirety. They worked from imagination rather than from an unobstructed view of what their own hands were putting on the rock. The picture existed in a head before it existed on rock, which means the person holding that torch was not sketching or experimenting at all. They were executing something already finished elsewhere. A plan carried in memory, scaled up to the size of a room, drawn blind, in a single pass by firelight. That is a level of skill and intention which has nothing whatsoever to do with primitive anything in any sense of that word. There is one more detail about this cave that gets told wrong constantly, and it concerns the name on the file. The site is known by a number instead of by a place, and the number is all anyone outside the field gets. And people reliably read that blank as a cover-up, which is very nearly the exact opposite of what it actually is. Southeastern cave art sites are numbered by convention, precisely so that the location of fragile clay never appears anywhere in print. The reason is a fingertip. These drawings survive for one reason only. They sit in soft clay that nothing has disturbed for roughly 18 centuries. One curious visitor with a hand out, one boot in the wrong place, and a figure that outlived Rome is gone. So the secrecy protects clay rather than a secret, and the thing worth hiding here was never the address on a map. Which brings this investigation to the animal itself, and to what that animal meant to the people who put it there. The pattern on the larger serpent is not generic decoration at all. It is diamonds, arranged the way one particular snake wears them. The eastern diamondback. The largest venomous snake on the continent, native to exactly the pine woods and sand hills that surround the mouth of that cave. An animal that anyone living in that country would have recognized instantly and would have had excellent reasons to respect. It was also sacred, not decorative and not a monster, but a figure of real power in the traditions of southeastern peoples. And that single word, sacred, changes the entire question of what kind of room this low chamber actually was. Caves across many southeastern traditions were understood as openings into something else, rather than as dead ends in the limestone. A boundary between the world where people farm and sleep and work, and another world understood to lie underneath it. Crossing that boundary was not recreation, and it was not exploration. It was a deliberate act, with real consequence attached. Which is where the internet gets loud. A giant serpent under Alabama is the sort of phrase that writes its own thumbnail, and the results are entirely predictable. Monsters, lost civilizations, something buried down there that somebody powerful supposedly does not want the public to see. None of that survives 5 minutes of honest contact with the site itself, or with the published paper describing it. The snake on that ceiling is not a creature somebody claimed to have met. It is a species still living in those woods. And it was drawn by people whose descendants are alive right now, living in that same region and carrying those same traditions. Turning their sacred figure into a horror story is not a bolder reading of the evidence than the researchers managed. It is a worse one. The honest version of this is stranger than the invented one anyway. These drawings were made by Native Americans of the Southeast, and the scientific record states that in the plainest possible way. The title of the scientific paper names them directly: Pre-Contact Native American Mud Glyphs from an Unnamed Cave in Alabama. Which is worth saying plainly and out loud, because the alternative keeps circulating regardless of how often it gets corrected. There was no lost race in these hills, no vanished European visitors, no builders imported from somewhere across an ocean. The people who made the largest cave drawing on this continent were the people who had always lived on this continent. They farmed the ridges above the cave, fired the pottery found on its floor, and carried the reed torches whose ash gave up the date. Their descendants were removed from that country by force, roughly 1,000 years after these drawings were finished in the clay. The art outlasted the removal. It was still up there on the ceiling, completely untouched, when the cameras finally arrived to look at it properly. So the authorship is settled, the date is bounded, The technique is understood, and even the animal is identified by species. Which makes the next admission from that same research team the most interesting sentence in this entire investigation. They do not know what the figures mean, and they say so directly rather than filling the gap with a guess. Not an unsolved puzzle waiting for one more sample, but a case where the usual key does not fit the lock. Across the whole Southeast, oral traditions preserve a very great deal, and archaeologists lean on them heavily and with genuine gratitude. Stories about the underworld, about serpents, about what caves are for, and what is owed to the powers inside them. The figures on this particular ceiling do not match any of those stories anywhere in the recorded body of them. They correspond to nothing recorded. The team offers a careful theory and flags it as a theory rather than a finding, which is the whole difference. The figures may represent spirits of the underworld, with their power expressed through their shape, their size, and their setting. May. That one word is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence, and it was put there deliberately. Investigations that take this long to research are expensive to make, and one tap on subscribe is what keeps them coming. Because the alternative to admitting ignorance is inventing a ritual, naming a cult, and then selling the invention as fact. The record does not support any of that, and these researchers refuse to pretend otherwise for the sake of a headline. What is left standing at the end is a room, 5 monumental images, and a purpose nobody currently alive can read. And an honest floor is a better place to stand than a confident guess, which is the whole reason this channel exists. That is the honest floor. And standing on it, one question still has no answer at all, which is the question this investigation opened with. Why enormous? Every other choice made inside that chamber makes complete practical sense the moment the physical conditions down there are properly understood. Clay is a surface, because clay was there and took a line. Torchlight, because there was no other light available. Lying flat on the back, because that ceiling allowed a working human body no other position whatsoever in the space. But size was entirely optional. Nothing about the cave, the clay, or the darkness demanded anything larger than a hand. Size was a decision. A serpent 2 feet long would have been visible whole, far easier to draw, and much safer to attempt blind. They made one that could never be looked at instead, and this continent holds one other object behaving exactly that way. Far to the north, in southern Ohio, a snake 1/4 of a mile long lies along a ridge above a creek. Built in heaped earth rather than pressed clay, by different people in a different century for reasons that remain equally unclear. And it shares the defect. Standing on that mound, a person sees a low bank of dirt and very little else. The animal only appears from above, which places 2 American serpents into the same genuinely strange category of image. 2 figures built at a scale that the human eye, standing at the site itself, was never able to receive. One needs height, one needs a scan. Neither of the 2 was made for the position that a living person actually occupies while standing there looking at it. Which suggests, without anything close to proving, that being seen by people may not have been the point of either. That is speculation, and it is labeled as speculation here, because the evidence supports the pattern and not the explanation. What is not speculation is the pattern itself, and it repeats across 1,000 miles and roughly 1,000 years. And there is one correction still owed before this closes, the one that was promised back at the very beginning. It concerns a single word that gets attached to this cave constantly in retellings, and it is the wrong word. This is not the oldest cave art in North America. That record belongs to the Cumberland Plateau in the cave country north of here, across the state line in Tennessee. Drawings there have been dated beyond 6,000 years, which is thousands of years older than anything on this Alabama ceiling. Found, as it happens, by the very same archaeologist who years later led the photogrammetry work inside this chamber. One researcher, two separate records in two neighboring states, in the same permanent dark, under the same limestone country. And the correction is the interesting part, rather than a disappointment, because it puts the right question in front of us. Tennessee holds the age, Alabama holds the scale. And scale is by far the harder of the two to explain. Age is circumstance. Somebody drew earlier than somebody else, and the earlier drawings happened to survive. That is luck, as much as intent. Scale is a decision. Somebody chose 11 feet inside a room that is physically incapable of ever showing 11 feet. Which is why the wrong word matters. Chasing oldest hides the actual anomaly sitting on that ceiling in plain view. So what is known, at the end of all this, comes down to a fairly short and very specific list. A chamber larger than a house, with a ceiling under 3 feet, in limestone country in the northern part of Alabama. 5 monumental figures pressed into wet clay by hand, sometime in the window between the 2nd century and the 10th. 2 serpents, the larger one 11 feet and marked as an eastern diamondback. 3 human figures, one of them in ceremonial dress. Made by woodland people of the southeast. Made entirely from memory, because the room they were working in made looking at the work impossible from the very start. Picture the moment that model finished rendering, in an office somewhere with the lights on and the coffee going cold beside it. A screen showing a ceiling that 4,000 separate photographs had quietly reassembled into a single continuous, measurable surface. And a serpent appearing on it, whole, for the first time since the day it was drawn into the clay. Somebody sitting in that lit office became the first human being in history to see the entire animal at once. Roughly 18 centuries after a person lay on their back in the dark and drew the whole thing by touch alone. What is not known is the part that matters most of all, and the researchers themselves are the ones who say so plainly. Nobody knows what it was for. Not the ceremony, not the belief system, not the reason a community sent one of its people into that crawl space with fire. The figures match no story that survived to be written down. Whatever explained them was carried by people in memory. Some of that knowledge was lost when those communities were driven out of this country by force and by law. Which is worth naming honestly rather than skipping. The gap in this record is not entirely an accident of time. And so the ceiling keeps the answer in exactly the same way that it kept the image itself for 1800 years. Perhaps the drawings were meant for the world that the cave opened onto, rather than for the world lying above it. Perhaps the act of making the thing mattered far more than any human viewing of it ever would have mattered. Perhaps nothing more than that. The cave is still there tonight, on private land, filed under a number instead of a name in the literature. Protected by the single thing that kept it intact for 18 centuries, which is simply that almost nobody ever goes in. The clay has not moved since. The lines sit exactly where a fingertip left them before Rome had finished falling. And the room is exactly as dark right now as it was on the night that the work was finally finished. There is one more way to hold all of this, and it starts from a question about audience rather than about technique. Every image humans make carries an assumption about who will stand in front of it and from what distance. A portrait assumes a room. A sign assumes a road. A cave ceiling 12 inches from the face assumes almost nothing. Unless the assumed viewer was never a person standing anywhere at all, in which case the geometry stops being a flaw. That reading cannot be tested, and the researchers do not advance it as a finding, which is worth repeating clearly. But it explains the one thing nothing else explains, the deliberate choice of a size that defeats human eyes. And it leaves the site exactly as honest as it was found, with a question in place of an answer. Which is where this account has to stop, back where it started, under the same low rock in Alabama. The account ends the way the cave does, with the largest drawing on this continent lying in the dark above an empty floor. In a cave in northern Alabama, there is a ceiling that a person can touch while sitting on the floor. On it, a serpent more than 11 feet long is still coiled in clay that was soft when Rome still stood. For almost the entire time that it has existed, nothing with eyes had ever once managed to see the thing whole. Now it exists twice. Once on rock in the dark, where it remains impossible to view from any angle a human body can reach. Once as a model on a screen, where it can be viewed by anyone at all and touched by nobody. The person who made it had neither version. They had a picture in their head and one pass to get it right. They got it right, then crawled back out, and the dark closed over the largest drawing on the continent. And whatever it was made for, they never saw it either.